Okay, Gary, we are now live.
Good evening, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join and listen to Commissioner Gary Kirkmire. He is going to share the city's new initiatives to prevent evictions and homelessness, and also what we did with our CARES Act dollars. These exciting programs will go a long way to protect our residents' right to safe, quality, affordable housing during this pandemic. Tonight, you hear about direct payments for emergency rent assistance, free legal assistance to tenants facing eviction, and grants to landlords to repair affordable housing rental units so they can get them on the market as soon as possible. In all, over $8 million have been made available for the important work of eviction and homelessness prevention. I am proud to support the efforts of our many partners who have long been dedicated to this cause and are ready to step up and help our residents at this critical time. Commissioner Kirkmire and his team have shown that we have an array of opportunities for grants to rehab your property and other ways we are using CARES Act funding to help us get through COVID 19. So please enjoy the presentation and feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions you may have. And thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's Town Hall meeting. Again, my name is Gary Kirkmire, and I'm the Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development with the city. Tonight's meeting agenda will consist of a brief presentation on our efforts associated with the COVID-19 CARES Act funding and a summary overview of the city's various property rehab programs. That will be followed by a question and answer session with a panel of my colleagues from MBD, along with City Council Member Mike Patterson. All questions for the panel discussion can be submitted via the chat feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our very best to respond to every question, time permitting. Additionally, for those of you who may have to cut out early, this presentation will be saved on the city's YouTube webpage and can be accessed there at a later time. So the city received to date more than $12.7 million in CARES Act funding. And that funding came to us by three different pipelines. Through our community development block grant funding, we received two rounds of funding that equaled about $7.3 million. Through two rounds of emergency solution grant funding, we've received about $5.3 million. And then we received one round of housing opportunity for people with AIDS funding at $142,000. The initial $10.3 million has been focused on three primary areas: resident support, business support, and property owner support. On the resident support side, we've allocated the bulk of this money, $6.8 million, and the majority of that money went in the form of eviction prevention in the form of direct rent assistance. That direct assistance is provided through our community partnership with Catholic Family Center, and it's allocated at $4.2 million. The other end of the eviction prevention perspective is in the form of legal assistance. We partnered with our Justice for All group and supported a program they developed that will provide legal representation to every tenant in the eviction process. And those services are provided by Law New York, Legal Aid Society, and Volunteer Legal Assistance Project. Additionally, on the resident side, we significantly increased the support for homelessness prevention, and we have several community partner agencies that are in that space. We provided free meals to our seniors in need, over 9,000 meals to date to over 1,200 customers. And we attempted to address the digital divide by providing almost 3,000 computers to fourth and fifth graders. One of the biggest subjects to date right now has been direct rent assistance and evictions and everything that's associated with that. Because of that, we wanted to make sure that we gave you as much information as we can prior to question and answer session. So on the direct rent assistance essential takeaways, it's important to note that all calls are handled now by 211. and that tenants can enter that information even if they haven't gotten their 14-day notice. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But their information can be entered into that system even if they haven't been served the 14-day notice yet. And that will make it that much quicker to expedite once they do get the 14-day notice. We wanted to make sure that you understand that the tenant can apply for assistance, and we work with, and how long it would take for you to know that they did that. So we know that a lot of times the landlord is involved with that process, but oftentimes you may not know that a tenant has started that application process. So we're working with Karazhak Family Center to develop a process by which they will give us the information on the units and the addresses where assistance has been sought. And then we will try to populate that on our housing webpage. That's in the works right now, and you should expect more to see on that soon. Some of the other things that questions that we've been getting are relative to the city's funding that we're talking about tonight. So it's important to keep in mind that all of this funding is federal funding. That's what we're talking about tonight, whether it's emergency solution grant funding or community development block grant funding. That's federal funding, and all of that funding has to be used in accordance with Hud Regs. So what are some of the Hud Regs? Well, one of the regs that HUD has is it requires a 14-day notice to have been served. There is funding that the county has at the table in the form of $4.3 million that does not have that associated requirement. But it's important to note that this funding is really earmarked towards two things: eviction prevention, homelessness prevention from HUD's perspective. And the reason why it requires a 14-day notice is because it's really built to serve people who are in threat of losing their housing. So that's the purpose of that requirement. It's important to note that these funds can pay up to 6 months back rent. It's important to note that these funds require the tenant to be able to sustain an existence in that unit. And again, that comes back to homelessness prevention, eviction prevention. So these funds that come from ESG and CDBG are earmarked to say, what does the tenant need? And does the tenant have a temporary solution whereby they can sustain an existence thereafter without additional services or funding? And so these funds in particular do have that requirement. It requires the unit to be habitable. And I know there's been questions about code violations. You can have code violations, but you can't have code violations that would render the unit uninhabitable. So it's important to know that we're aware of that, and we are working with Karazhak Family Center to advise them when we believe, based on our system and what's in our system in the terms of violations, whether or not that unit should be determined uninhabitable. So the way the process is going to work is Karazhak Family Center will advise us on a regular basis when they have an applicant that has violations as per our property information system, which they have access to. They will relay that information over to city staff, who will look further into those violations to determine, do they impact the tenant's ability to safely reside in that unit? If they do, then our staff will reach out to the responsible party, the owner or the manager, and let them know that a tenant has started the process to get rent assistance, which could help you, and that these particular violations of health and safety nature are preventing that from moving forward. In addition to the resident support, we've provided business support. The majority of this has been in the form of our business emergency retention grants. About 1.5 million has been allocated to that. We've had 644 applications to date. And just to give you some perspective of how many applications that is, in a typical non-pandemic year, we're budgeting 55 business grants a year. So that has been an enormous demand that has come to our business development staff. We've had over $1.2 million out the door to date. We also partner with 20 restaurants that provided these meals that I referenced a short time ago to our seniors. And then we wanted to assess the situation, particularly with restaurants, but with businesses in general, where your capacity to serve people indoors has been limited by the pandemic. And so in order for businesses to be able to serve an equal amount of customers that they were formerly used to, and possibly be able to retain as many staff as they used to in doing so, we wanted to make sure that we had some available resources for them and streamlined processes to broaden their footprint outdoors. And we did that on private property through a streamlined no-fee zoning process. And we did that on public property in the right-of-way with a no-fee streamlined process with our partners in environmental services. So just a bit more information on the emergency retention grant process. For those of you that may not have got into that process as of yet, you can download an application online. And again, you don't really need to worry about writing down these addresses, web addresses, because this program, this video will be saved on the city's YouTube site. You complete the application electronically and you can submit it to the email address that's identified there. And you should receive a confirmation email a short time after that. A project manager will be assigned to review your application and will contact you to assess to make sure your application is complete and all documents are there. Completed applications will require documentation be sent for approval, and an agreement will be emailed to you generally within 1 day. Businesses should submit the originally signed agreement to City Hall. We have to have the original document. And upon signed agreement, the project manager will process a check, and it usually can be issued within 2 weeks. Just to give you a sense of what types of businesses have applied to date, we've had a big demand for food industry. We've served a lot of barbershops and salons. We've also been able to serve entertainment, convenience stores, professional, auto garages, and fitness facilities. On the property owner side, we've dedicated $4.7 million. We've increased our foreclosure prevention services that are provided by our community partners at the Housing Council and Empire Justice. We've increased the support for Lifespan to help with aging in place. We've increased the Emergency Repair Assistance Program. That's a program that's a city grant program that helps with things like water heaters, furnaces. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We've, as we just mentioned, the delinquent rent assistance through Catholic Family Center. That's the bulk of this support. And keep in mind that this support goes directly to landlords. Yes, tenants have to apply because it's important that through the 211 mechanism that their situation is assessed for whatever needs that we have in the community that can serve those needs are identified up front. But these checks, they go to the landlord. And then we developed the Landlord Grant program to incentivize the rehab, minor rehab of vacant units. That program was set up initially to max out at $2,000 per unit. We're raising that to $4,000 a unit. So in addition to these grant programs, it's important to know, and this is what really gives it the value that it does, is there's these external supports, because this is a community collaborative effort all the way around with every one of these subjects. I mentioned the county has $4.3 million in direct rent assistance at the table. We've had streamlined rental assistance intake via the Monroe County and 211 Systems Integration Project. The court systems have dedicated a housing court to hear eviction cases. And it's really in all of these, what we call four targeted approaches to this eviction prevention, which are inclusive of direct rent assistance, dedicated housing court, streamlined intake process. And that's what really gives it the value collectively, and legal assistance for the tenants to be able to say, when we get to the adjudication process, if these services have not been accessed to date, everybody in that process knows of these services and can serve both the tenant and landlord by having that knowledge. In addition to the computers that we have supplied to the 4th and 5th graders, the school district was able to give MiFi units that gives data and internet access to them for the school year. And then Monroe County just released this week another small business grant that will support businesses from 2 to 50 full-time employees. And there's a lot more information on the county site about that. So just some of the highlights of the funding that's been allocated to date. These are things we've just talked about, but just to reiterate some of the major highlights. $4.2 million, again, to direct rent assistance, over $8 million totally between city and county. almost $500,000 for the Justice for All effort to make sure that tenants are afforded legal representation, $1.5 million in the business grants to offset day-to-day expenses like things like rent, utilities, and again, 644 applications to date. More than $1 million to provide computers to fourth and fifth graders. We talked about the 9,000 free meals to our seniors in need. And collectively to date, we've served through all of these programs almost 7,000 people. So what's the path forward? We still have this $2.4 million, around three in community development block grant funding that has not been appropriated or allocated as of yet. So what are we doing? We're assessing the effectiveness and impact of each program. The City Council has asked for a monthly summary report on who's being served in each of these programs, how many people. We want to monitor and continue to monitor the eviction process for needs as the courts open back up. There's been a lot of surveys to landlords. There's some estimated needs out there, but really we need to keep our eyes and ears open for this and be able to have some flexibility to adjust where adjustment is needed. We're having ongoing conversations with HUD regarding the flexibility or inflexibility of the rental assistance effort. So know that we are continuing to engage HUD. We're seeking to get some more flexibility where we don't currently have it. And that will continue until we can see if we can develop a program that may better suit the needs of the community. As I said before, we worked on these programs to broaden the footprint of primarily restaurants, but businesses in general outside. And we want to see, with the impactful winter coming up, is there a means by which we can continue that? And we're working with business community to see if there's a reasonable way that we can do that given our 4 seasons. We're also going to be meeting with the business community next week to see, are there any other needs that we're missing? We're 9 months or so into the process now. Are there needs that are new now that we didn't know about early on when we developed the retention grant program? And then again, we're in the process of assessing the most effective way to utilize this $2.4 million. And we will continue to engage all parties in the process. So on the city property rehab grant program side, I wanted to take the opportunity to make sure we remind people that we have these grants. Most of these grants have been existing, but we want to take the opportunity with people tuning in to remind them that these grants are still available and accessible. So what are some of those grants? We have a roof grant for owner occupants. We try to give priority to our seniors, age 62 and older. The property must be a single family, and it's available currently on a first come, first served basis, although we have used a lottery format because of the demand. We have a general rehab available to owner occupants. This is to address things like hazards. You could be addressed for lead hazards, but it can deal with any other health and safety related hazards and or blight. We try to prioritize this in targeted areas where we have active housing development, but it is a citywide program. And then I talked a little bit about the emergency assistance grant. That's available to owner occupants for things like furnace, water heaters, water service replacement lines. That grant can be used in conjunction with a lead grant. Continuing on with grants, we have our lead grant. We've been really blessed with being able to be successful in applying to HUD for lead grants. And I know a lot of landlords have taken advantage of this program, as have some owner occupants. And we want them to continue to do so. We've driven down lead poisoning in this city with the help and support of our investors and landlords, and we want to keep going down that positive path. So that's available to both owner occupants and landlords. It's to remediate lead-based paint hazards in residential properties, and they can be anything from a 1 to a 4 family. If it is an owner occupant, they must have a child under the age of 6. And if it's a landlord, tenants must meet income guidelines. We have this new landlord grant that I referenced before for vacant properties, to take vacant properties and get them back into active service. It was kind of our way of saying we understand landlords are under a lot of financial situation crisis right now. And one of the ways that we were trying to give relief is, we know you're going to try to turn over the unit anyway, But this was our way of being able to create a program for landlords that will incentivize, what you very likely would be doing anyway, but would be able to offset those costs of doing so, because we know that your finances are hurting because of rents. What the secondary goal of that program is to house, ultimately, once it's rehab, a tenant at or below 60% AMI. And then that program, as well as the one I referenced before, emergency grant, can be used in conjunction with lead. So if you're a landlord, you can get a lead grant, and you can tap into this landlord reimbursement grant for rehabbing a vacant unit. So for more information on these, in the first one up here, this first website is really important, because Jumpstarting Rock has a wealth of information about the COVID and the pandemic response, not just NBD, but citywide and beyond the city. It has a lot of connecting points to assistance beyond the city services. So make sure that you check out jumpstartingrock.com if you haven't already. It also keeps up to date with people that have been served and that kind of thing. For our applications for our property rehab grants, there's the website for that. All of our rehab grants now, the application processes go through our neighborhood service centers. So if you're not familiar with your local neighborhood service center, you should be, and those are the addresses of our service centers. And you can get access to the applications online and hand them into a service center, or you can visit a service center and get one. So now we're going to shift into the question and answer portion. We did want to allocate an appropriate amount of time in case there are, and we know there's going to be a lot of questions. So serving on the panel, we have City Council member Mike Patterson from the Northeast District. Mike is also the MBD chair, committee chair. Dana Miller is the Deputy Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development. Ann DeCivitella is Assistant Commissioner of MBD, and she's going to play the moderator role. Daisy Algarin is our Director of our Neighborhood Service Centers. Carol Wheeler is our Manager of Housing. Thad Schofield is our Director of Business Development. And Joanna Santiago is our Manager of Contract Services. And Contract Services is the unit that handles the rehab grant programs. So with that, we will shift right into questions. You're on mute, Ed.
Thank you. I will read out the questions and my colleagues on the panel will answer as we go along. Just to remind folks to continue to put their questions in the Q&A section. There's a question here about a property owner with rental income loss due to COVID wants to know where he can register for the rehab grants for the vacant units.
Okay, I can start with that, and then if Daisy wants to chime in. So again, all of our rehab, city rehab grant programs, the applications can be obtained online, but they are served through they are submitted to our neighborhood service centers. So depending on what area you're in, whether it's the Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, Northwest, you should submit it to that appropriate neighborhood service center. Daisy, if you wanted to add anything to that.
The neighborhood service centers are open from 9 to 4 daily. We are still serving through our Dropbox system. So if you drop off your information, we will get back to you within 24 hours. If it's a Friday, you will most likely be hearing back on a Monday.
Okay, so we have another question. Will the city help tenants that have not been COVID affected and just decided not to pay their rent?
So I'll start with that, and then I'll ask Carol Wheeler, our Manager of Housing, to chime in. So there are other resources in the community to help with tenants that are behind on rent. So I don't want to give the impression that these are the only funds out there. They're certainly not the only funds out there. Carol, if you want to take it from there. You might be on mute, Carol.
I was. Sorry about that. As far as these dollars, the ESG and CDBG dollars that was mentioned relative to rental assistance, one of the things is that we want to make sure that, yes, these funds are going toward those individuals that have been impacted by COVID. And what that means is someone during this particular time has had a loss of income or loss of employment, loss of assistance, and they're unable to pay their rent. This is what these funds are designated for. And as the commissioner mentioned, that there are other resources in the community that may be able to help non-COVID or pandemic related rent arrears.
Thank you. There's a question for my colleague around the landlord reimbursement grant. If someone owns a commercial property that has a vacant residential unit, will that property qualify for the landlord reimbursement grant?
So the answer is yes to a certain extent, and I'll let Joanna Santiago, our manager of contract services, explain that further.
So the landlord reimbursement grant is assistance for vacant units, and yes, you can use funds. You can apply for this program if you have a commercial property, as long as it's up to 7 residential units.
Thank you. And Commissioner, you did answer this question, but someone has is taking it further. Tenants have reported that if they do not have a way to pay rent going forward, they are denied. Is this going to change?
So, I mean, we would like to know more about that, because our understanding is there are additional resources where that may apply to that. But I think more than that, what I want to focus on is we are, when I reference the fact that we're continuing to have conversations with HUD, that's kind of what I'm talking about, is we really want to get some authority to develop a program that's more appropriate so it addresses that more specifically. But we will get with Catholic Family Center and discuss, that outcome of that kind of scenario, because our assessment and our assumption is that there are resources that could possibly be applied there.
Okay, switching over to a question about the business development grants. What types of assistance can the grant offer?
So I'll just start real quick, and then I'll ask Thad Schofield, our Director of Business Development, to take it from there. So really, that was designed to offset the day-to-day expenses of a business. I referenced some of the things before, but we really wanted to have it, not to go towards something that you additionally had to incur, but your day-to-day expenses that you already incur. And Thad, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure, thanks, Gary. It can be used for unpaid rent, unpaid utilities, inventory, payroll, things that are not covered by the SBA payroll protection program to avoid a duplication of efforts. But any of those unpaid working expenses, daily operating expenses that are incurred where revenue isn't coming in, our grant can help pay for those things.
Okay. Another question, just to clarify, because I think, Commissioner, you may have touched upon this, but the landlords and the property managers out there are wondering how they can find out where their tenants are in the process when they're dealing with the Catholic Family Center for the tenant assistance program.
So I'll chime in on what I know, and then maybe Carol knows additional information. So what I had talked about is, we're trying to work out a process by which Catholic Family Center can send us the database of applicants that are in the pipeline. I'm not sure if it will be inclusive of where they are in the pipeline, but nonetheless, what our intent with that information was to populate it on our webpage so that at least that they're in the process. And one of the things I mentioned before was, this ESG and the CDBG funds are tied to that 14-day notice because they're earmarked for people that are in threat of losing housing. But that said, I also mentioned the fact that that new system integration through 211 allows a tenant to get into the process, even if that's a stopgap, because then when they get the 14-day notice, they can have it quickly expedited thereafter. So it really is a new, unique, and a more efficient system that's been implemented, and it's targeted to be more efficient with the complexities of what we're dealing with now. And I don't know, Carol, if you wanted to add anything else about the, the current status, if you will, of the applications.
We're still exploring ways of how we can get information out. And we do, just also want to just caution everyone is that when we talk about providing information about tenants, then we have to be careful about confidentiality. So as we're exploring what we can do and what information that we can provide, just making sure that we're keeping some information confidential.
Okay, thank you. A question about the senior meal program. How much longer will that program run for? And will it be refunded when it runs out?
So I'll start, and then Daisy can chime in if she wants to. So that program was developed to be a 3-month pilot. So there was, I think it was $300,000 that was put into that program. And it was to get meals out to seniors for a 3-month period. That program, just like all the other programs that we talked about, we are assessing as part of our assessment of what to do with this $2.4 million in community development block grant round 3 funding that has not yet been allocated. So it is being assessed for whether or not it's appropriate to consider that for continuation. It's likely to time out at some point here. It's certainly going to time out by the end of November, but it's very likely to time out before that time period because of the demand. And I don't know, Daisy, if I caught everything or you want to add anything.
No, you did catch everything, Commissioner. The program has been well received, and we are, as you said, assessing to see if we can continue on with the program.
And Daisy, real quick, how many restaurants participated or are participating in the program, and how were they selected?
20 restaurants are participating. We had a competitive grant of a proposal request, and we had, I would say, about 40 restaurants apply. We selected 20, 4 per quad, including Center City.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A question about the rent assistance process. It's a 2-part question. One of it is how long does it take to get through the process? But while you're answering that, maybe we can also add this question. Can you detail the intake process via 211 and the Catholic Family Center, and maybe talk about some of the requirements?
Okay, I'll start, and then Carol can take it from there. This is common with every application process. Usually the speed at which we can process, whether it's us or a community partner, can process applications is first and foremost dependent on getting the necessary documentation and that's required to qualify somebody for that process. It doesn't matter if it's a grant, rehab grant, rent assistance, they're all processes and they're all qualifying processes. And especially those, because they're regulated under HUD requirements, you have to make sure income guidelines are met and the wealth of other things that some of which we've talked about already with rent assistance. So, the speed at which you can get the information into the system is going to serve very well in terms of how fast it can be expedited. Now, that said, the additional piece of that we've already talked about a couple of times here is that 14-day notice as it relates to the ESG and CDBG funds. There are funds out there that are not tied to that, but for our funds that we have allocated towards this effort, they are dependent on that 14-day notice. So, Carol, I don't know if you wanted to go through maybe the intake a little bit more clearly. If you're speaking, you're on mute, Carol.
Yeah. just took myself off. Thank you. So first and foremost, and Commissioner, you definitely did a good job as far as outlining some of just the information that is necessary as far as getting through the process. First of all, you do have to contact 211. Contact 211, and a referral will be sent over to the participating um, community organizations, and in particular, the one that we have funded is Catholic Family Center. And once you have that referral, you have already actually been given a lot of the information that is going to need it, that's going to be needed by Catholic Family Center. So your 211, that whole conversation with them kind of outlines all the documentation that's actually going to be needed. So once you are get that referral and you get over to Catholic Family Center, you can have a lot of that information in hand. But there is still a screening process once you get into Catholic Family Center, just to go over, the documentation, making sure that you understand the process. And after, that happens, then you're able to move on to basically the next step, say, with reviewing all the documentation, making sure that you have met all the income qualifications, everything that is needed. And after that, all the approvals have been done, then you're moving through the process and able to actually get a check cut. But I do have to go back and just say, even once you have checked out your information, what happens? The landlord is also verifying the information. And once everything checks out, then a check can be cut and forwarded on to the landlord.
Thank you. So there's a question here about some of it we've touched upon already. The properties cannot have code violations. Otherwise, they don't receive support, tenant support. The result is that the tenant is stuck and maybe ultimately lands in the eviction process. Is there anything we can do to coordinate resources to repair and update properties so landlords can participate in the program and prevent further evictions?
So, yeah, I'll tackle that. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but we'll go over it again. So what the HUD guidelines say is that funding cannot be used to support an uninhabitable unit. In other words, it has to be habitable. It has to be safe for the occupant. And so Catholic Family Center, who is screening applicants as they come through, is limited to only having access to our property information system. And the information in the property information system can only tell you that there are violations. It doesn't tell you what the violations are. So every incident where they see there's violations, they are referring to the city, and we are in turn looking at those particular violations as they relate to the subject unit. So if it's a 10-unit building and Unit 1 has applied for rent assistance and none of the violations impact Unit 1, that will be a non-issue for the process. If there are health and safety violations in Unit 1 and it is preventing a habitable situation, then we will reach out, our staff will reach out to the owner and or manager, whoever our point of contact with the property is, to let them know that, hey, you've got a tenant that's trying to get assistance. That assistance is going to support you. And in order for them to get through the process, we have to mitigate or abate these particular issues. We will minimize that subject area to things that prevent somebody from living safely in a unit. So these are going to be isolated areas. They're going to be few and far between. It's going to be a really small percent of the overall units. Just to give you an example, I think from the first 2,000 or so applicants in the system, there There was a very small percent that even had code violations. I think it was 10% or something in that neighborhood. If we drill down further into that, it's going to be a very small subset of that group that actually have health and safety issues. But we will try to resolve those verbally with the responsible party and give them opportunity to abate those things.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Someone here is asking, are there programs for people living with HIV/AIDS?
Yes, absolutely. I'll kick it to Carol, but the one funding source that I identified early on in the presentation was we did get $142,000 for housing for opportunities with people with AIDS. And Carol, I don't know if you want to take that from there and how they can seek services.
For persons that are unfortunately suffering with AIDS, you can apply through Trillium Health, as well as Catholic Charities. Both of them are providing rental assistance and support to those households that may have someone in that family suffering from HIV/AIDS. So just contacting Trillium Health or Catholic Charities, and they will take you through the process to receive the assistance. And how this particular program is a lot different from some of the others is that this is ongoing rental assistance and not necessarily just say rental arrears.
Okay, a question on the rehab program. Many times the city requires all taxes to be up to date. Will that be a requirement for the current rehab programs?
Okay, I'll handle that one. So these are, again, we're talking about federal dollars and these are HUD regulations. So HUD does force us to check the situation to make sure both the taxes and any mortgage are current. Because where they stand with that is they want that asset preserved. They don't want to grant something to a property that is going to be lost by that particular owner. So you do have to have taxes current. Now that said, is the city does have a tax agreement process. And that tax agreement process is a pretty easy, streamlined process. You know, it requires 10% down. You can spend that or spread that debt out over a 5-year period. It does require code enforcement to approve it in conjunction with the tax collection department. But, you know, even if you have outstanding issues, as long as we're on the same page in terms of a work plan and where you're going in terms of mitigating those issues, getting a tax agreement is not difficult.
Okay, are there non-ESG/CDBG funds available through Catholic Family Center for rent delinquent assistance that don't require 14-day notice?
Yeah, I'll start and Carol can confirm and or expand on it. So our understanding is that the county's funding is not tied to those regs. So there should be substantial amounts of money there that's accessible, that's not dependent on the 14-day notice. Carol, did I miss anything?
Nope, you're absolutely correct. And yes, Catholic Family Center has access to those program funds for rental arrears.
Okay, a question on the business development program. How many times can a business owner apply for a grant through that program?
So I'll kick that over to Deputy Commissioner Dana Miller to respond to.
Yes, thanks for that question. A business can apply up to 2 times for that grant, and it's a maximum of $5,000. When we first started the grant, we had a $2,000 maximum, and we had a number of businesses that applied. Following that, we had a number of businesses that came back and said, is there a way we might be able to apply again? And because we had received more money from the federal government, we were able to expand that. So there is a current maximum of $5,000.
And let me just add something to that, Ann. So I think another takeaway from that is, again, as I mentioned in the presentation, we are continuously assessing these programs. We're continuously assessing need. So I know sometimes it feels like you're alone or that we forgot about you. We have not forgot about anybody. We're well aware of where the stresses are. And just to use that example, we started that program with $2,000 being the max because we didn't know if we were going to be able to meet the universal demand if we went higher. We, subsequent to operating that program for a little while, determined that we could raise it. We just did the same thing with the Landlord Grant. We started that grant at $2,000. We're subsequently raising that to $4,000. So we're constantly assessing, and we will take action as long as we can take the action, and we're empowered and authorized to do so, to make these processes as easy and effective as they can be.
Okay. If a property is in a zip code that crosses over into a neighboring suburb, will they qualify for assistance? An example is 14606.
Is that specific to rent assistance?
Rent assistance, I think it's to all the programs at the city. At least let's answer it from the city's own point of view.
So all of the city funding can only support city properties. But there is, as we mentioned before a couple of times, there are other resources in the community that can be utilized outside of the city. An example of that is the county funding for rent assistance we just referred to. So, and there's a county has a business grant that can go outside the city perimeter. So there are funding resources, and that's why I said one of the best resources that you can have is that Jumpstarting Rock website, because even if it's not specifically captured there, it can get you to these other resources or these websites where you can access all of the variety of resources that are available, both in city and outside of city.
Okay, we have a question here specifically. Actually, a few people have asked this question regarding what the dollar amount is, the limits available for the home rehab grant. They're asking about the process, but I imagine that can be found online, but maybe we can speak to the dollar amounts for the grant programs for rehab.
Is it the general rehab that they're questioning, or is it
They
not?
just said home rehab grant, so.
Okay, well, Joanna, you can capture that if you can. I would probably go through each of the programs and talk about limitations that we have.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Yeah, go ahead, council member.
Okay, so the last question back was about zip codes, saying if the property were located in a zip code that was adjacent to the suburbs, would that have any impact on being able to apply? Was that the question, or am I close to the question as it was asked?
The way I interpreted it was if you're in a zip code but outside the city perimeter, that's the way I responded to it. I'm not sure.
Right. So I get it. If you're outside the city, we obviously can't help you. But if you're inside the city, if you're inside the city, you're inside the city, and you should apply.
Right. And,
okay.
and even if you're outside the city for a variety of these programs, the county has programs that are similar and can be utilized.
Yeah, and just to clarify to the person who asked that question, because they added a little bit more, where would they go? And it looks like the person has concluded that they can go only to the county. And I think, yes, to the county, but also to your municipality, even if it's Irondequoit or Greece or Brighton, because they might have their own programs as well, similar to the city's programs.
Right. So the question just started. Joanna, I don't know if you were talking and muted, but if you want to just go through the programs and talk about the limits, the the financial limits?
So for the emergency assistance program, it's based on, we have 2 contracts with our contractor for furnace and for hot water tanks. So based on the cost that it's gonna take them to fix the furnace or replace it, that's the quote that we use. There's really no limit to that, as long as it, is an emergency assistance. For the general rehab, the cap is for HUD's regulations is $24,999. Otherwise, it triggers other federal requirements. The lead program is, there's no limit also, it's just the only limit to the program is basically we can only use the funds to remediate lead hazards. For the roof program, again, it's an open bid, so we have contractors bidding, so it's a competition, so whoever's the lowest bid is who's selected for the program. And then for the landlord, like Gary said, we raised it up to 4,000. And it's used to, reimburse landlords for whatever their cost is to make that unit habitable.
And a follow-up to that, either for the commissioner or for Joanna, is can people combine, are there circumstances where they might be able to combine more than one of these grants for rehab?
So one of the things that we had included in the presentation was you can combine an emergency assistance grant with lead, and you can combine, if you're a landlord, a lead grant and a vacant unit reimbursement grant. So yes, you can combine a couple of these different grants.
Okay, so there's a question here saying, I'm gonna try and, it's a bit long, but besides agreeing to avoid eviction, are there any other items the housing provider will be required to agree to in addition to avoiding eviction in exchange for the rental assistance on behalf of the tenant? Are there any other items in the small print of the agreement when accepting these rental assistance funds?
I'll ask Carol to respond to that.
No, there isn't any other fine print items or anything that you would need to actually respond to if you are accepting the rental assistance payments. You're speaking specifically for the landlord. Is there anything else? Was that it, Anne? I'm sorry, just want to make sure that it was clear.
Yes, I believe that this is probably a property owner who wants to know basically what else they'll be on the hook for when accepting the rental assistance on behalf of their tenants.
Right, yeah. And there wouldn't be anything else as long as that tenant is going to be able to remain in place.
Okay. Commissioner Kirkmire, this one might be, it's a little bit more specific, but generally it relates to inspections for code violations and how they impact these programs. Somebody has a unit, a Section 8 unit that had a code violation. They corrected the code violation, but the COVID pandemic stopped inspectors from returning. How long should it take to get the unit violation satisfied and back rent paid? Bit of a complicated one there.
So, well, I can't, if it's Section 8, if it's specific to Section 8, I can't really comment for RHA because that's a Rochester Housing Authority program. So if you're talking about specifically a Section 8 inspection and any back rents dealing directly with RHA, you really are going to have to address that question to RHA. I can't speak verbatim to RHA's expectations, policies, or back rent, agreements that they have.
Okay. Well, I think we have time for one last question, and Actually, it's the last question, so there are not any other unanswered questions. And it is simply, will the slides be shared after the meeting?
So again, the whole presentation will be housed on the city's YouTube webpage. They're going to catalog these. The intent is to have these on a weekly basis. Last week was the first one. So I would imagine that it's going to be up there for quite some time, but it certainly will be up there in the short term.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll hand it back to you, Commissioner.
All right. So again, in closing, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you found the information to be useful. I know it's a very chaotic, very scary time for everyone. I want to thank our expert panelists and advise anyone who had to join us late, again, that the presentation will be saved on the city's YouTube page and can be accessed there. I encourage anyone who may not have had a question answered to follow up with our NBD staff, and there's a variety of ways that you can access us. We're going to keep working at this. We're going to keep working with HUD and trying to get the relief that we need to provide you the relief you need. And we really are all in this together. So have a great night and be safe.